So now that we have explored the structures and functions of the cerebrum, we can now turn our attention to the diencephalon. So remember that the diencephalon forms the inner core of the brain, and it is almost completely surrounded by the two large cerebral hemispheres around it. So recall that the diencephalon consists of three paired structures. We had the oval or egg-shaped thalamus, which is located superiorly, the triangular-shaped hypothalamus, which is located anteriorly and inferiorly, and we also had the small epithalamus, which makes up the posterior aspect of the diencephalon. So let's begin with the thalamus. So the thalamus is a mass of neurons that contain many nuclei. Now recall that nuclei in the context of the nervous system means a group of neuron cell bodies that is located within the central nervous system. So often a nucleus of neurons are a group of neurons that have a similar function to one another. So you can kind of look at these nuclei as functional areas of the thalamus, so that as each nucleus is going to be tasked with a specific function. We also see that because the thalamus has a right and a left half, we have a small bridge of tissue that joins the right and left halves. This bridge of tissue is usually called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. It's also sometimes referred to as the interthalamic adhesion. So turning back to the concept of the nuclei of the thalamus. This diagram shows the primary nuclei of the thalamus. And you can see that each nucleus has a specific name and location within the thalamus. So again, think of each nucleus as a different functional area. And so that means that neurons within a specific nucleus will be completing a specific task or a specific set of tasks. So since each nucleus has a functional specialty, what we also see is that each nucleus projects fibers or neuron axons to specific regions of the cerebral cortex, and these nuclei kind of in turn also receive neuron axons from very specific regions of the cerebral cortex. So these nuclei are sending out information to the cerebral cortex and also receiving information from the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is in very close contact and communication as well with the cerebral cortex. So because of its function in communicating with the cerebral cortex, we often refer to the thalamus or call the thalamus the gateway to the cerebrum, because the thalamus acts to relay most of the sensory information coming from the body's sense organs and sensory receptors to the cerebral cortex. So also within the thalamus too, we see that information is sorted out and edited, and this means that the thalamus is involved with some information processing and filtering before that information is passed on to the cerebrum for interpretation. So because of its close communication and contact with the cerebrum, and specifically the functional areas of the cerebral cortex, the thalamus is often referred to as the gateway to the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. The thalamus also receives input from the cerebellum and communicates that information to the primary motor cortex of the cerebrum. So using this information, the primary motor cortex can execute voluntary muscle movements. So kind of in summary here, the thalamus plays a very key role in mediating sensation, controlling motor or mediating motor activities, arousing the cortex for activity, that is kind of priming the cortex for functional work and processing. The thalamus is also involved somewhat in learning and memory tasks as well. So now we'll turn our attention to the hypothalamus. So in a similar way to the thalamus, the hypothalamus is a structure that consists of many nuclei. But unlike the thalamus, the main functions of the hypothalamus are that it acts as the visceral control center for the body, and indeed the hypothalamus is really important in regulating homeostasis. So a lot of the functions that are associated with the hypothalamus have to do with controlling homeostasis. So let's take a look at some of those functions now. So the hypothalamus controls most of the autonomic nervous system, or I should say a good majority of the autonomic nervous system. It also regulates things like body temperature. So there's a specific nucleus within the hypothalamus that specifically acts as our thermostat and regulates body temperature. There are also nuclei that regulate food intake, water balance, thirst, so that is taking in of water in addition to food. The hypothalamus controls physical responses to emotions. It has a part in controlling sleep and wake cycles, and the way that it does this, there is a nucleus within the hypothalamus that essentially contains our 24-hour daytime clock, and so that's kind of how our body keeps track of time, even when it's dark outside or we can't see the sunlight. So our body still has an idea of exactly what time of day it is, and so that way it can be performing the necessary functions at that specific time of day. We also see that the hypothalamus is involved somewhat in controlling endocrine function, and we'll explore that here in the next slide. So the hypothalamus also functions in kind of a major capacity in the as far as endocrine function goes, or it functions in an endocrine-like capacity, as the hypothalamus actually creates several different types or classifications of hormones. And we see that the hypothalamus is also very closely associated with the pituitary gland. So this little ball of tissue here is the pituitary gland at the base of the hypothalamus. And the pituitary gland is actually connected to the hypothalamus by a small stalk of tissue that's called the infundibulum. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are actually physically connected to one another. So the hypothalamus can control the hormones that the pituitary gland releases. So the hypothalamus regulates the release of hormones from the pituitary gland using classes of hormones that are called releasing hormones. And these releasing hormones promote the release of specific hormones from the pituitary gland. But the hypothalamus also produces a class of hormones called inhibiting hormones. And these inhibiting hormones actually prevent the release of specific hormones from the pituitary gland. And we'll get a better look at particularly at how these releasing hormones work when we talk about the endocrine system in A&P2. So we'll look at a pathway called the hypothalamic pituitary pathway, in which we explore the functions of these releasing hormones and the types of hormones that are released from the pituitary gland by hypothalamic releasing hormones. It also creates two other hormones. One of them is called oxytocin, and the other one is called antidiuretic hormone. So let's take a look at what these two hormones do specifically. So recall that from chapter 1, when we talked about feedback cycles, I mentioned the positive feedback cycle of the contractions of the uterus during childbirth, and the primary hormone, the primary chemical signal that controls those contractions of the uterus, is oxytocin. Next, we have antidiuretic hormone, which is also abbreviated ADH, but it also goes by another name called vasopressin, and we'll see why that is in a second. But basically, antidiuretic hormone functions to conserve body water when we are dehydrated. And the way that this hormone works is that the hormone stimulates the kidney to absorb water from the urine that it is forming. And so it takes that water out of the urine that's forming, and it puts that water back into the blood. So in this way, the kidney is conserving body water rather than losing that water with the urine. At the same time, though, because we have water being added back to the blood, this actually causes our blood pressure to rise. And so this is why ADH is also referred to as vasopressin, because not only does it conserve body water, but it also functions kind of indirectly to increase blood pressure. So those are the major functional areas, I should say, of the hypothalamus and major functional structures. But let's look at a couple of other anatomical structures that are associated with the hypothalamus. And these structures include the optic chiasma, and the mammillary bodies. So the optic chiasma is an X-shaped structure that's at the base of the hypothalamus, and the optic chiasma functions as a relay pathway for sensory information coming from the eyes and going to the thalamus. On the other hand here, the mammillary bodies, which are these small P-shaped structures just behind the optic chiasma, the mammillary bodies actually act as relay centers for olfactory sensory information coming from the nose. So that is the sense of smell, or sensory information from the sense of smell is being routed from the nose through the mammillary bodies and to the thalamus. So remember, all sensory information, or most sensory information going to the cerebrum is routed to the cerebrum through the thalamus. And so both the optic chiasma and mammillary bodies are feeding that information to the thalamus. So the final structure of the diencephalon is a small structure called the epithalamus, and it's located at the posterior aspect of the diencephalon. The major structure to note within the epithalamus is a small gland that's referred to, or is called the pineal gland, and this gland is named the pineal gland because it is shaped like a pine nut. And this gland is the major site of production for a hormone called melatonin. Now, melatonin is a hormone that really kind of helps control drowsiness and alertness drowsiness at night and alertness in the morning. And so this graph here actually shows that the release and the concentrations of melatonin is not consistent throughout the day. So rather, we see major releases of melatonin occurring during the evening when the sun begins to set, and the level of melatonin in our blood peaks in the early morning hours, and then very quickly, kind of after its peak, the hormone nearly vanishes from the blood at sunrise. And so because of this time-dependent release, melatonin is often called the hormone of darkness. So it is the hormone that is responsible for causing drowsiness at night. So that is, as levels of melatonin in the blood rise in the evening, that causes us to become drowsy. And as melatonin levels decrease as dawn approaches, that essentially removes that drowsiness and causes a wakefulness effect. And so this hormone actually serves to regulate our sleep and wake cycles.